see. Okay, yeah, we're now live. I will also put the conversation to record so we can then have a good archive of the conversation. I'm gonna put this like this. Okay. Well, yeah, we are now live, so I hope everything is going smoothly. Let's start the conversation. First of all, thank you again, Jesse and Nanako, for doing this. It's such a pleasure for me to talk with you again, this time in the context of the Institute of Architecture. There is this new space for research and education in architecture that we're starting to pull off a couple of years ago, and it's great to have you, so thank you for taking the time and doing this.
Pleasure.
Well, I'm going to start with a little introduction of you two. So the first time we talked was a couple of years ago, where you presented a lecture about your work, and from there it emerged a beautiful article in English that you can find in RUR Architecture's website under the title Looking Forward to Look Back. And in Spanish we produced a book called Projective Theories that is also that text feature, but in Spanish. And this text goes through the work of the office in a chronological way, reconstructing some of the ideas and moments that fueled the projects developed for more than 30 years. So today I would like to propose a different approach. I will try to engage in a conversation regarding some of the ideas, techniques, and concepts behind the work, trying to reconstruct not necessarily a linear history of your practice, but, well, let me first introduce you two, Jesse and Nanako. Well, Reiser Umemoto, as you know, is an office of architecture that was at the center of what we might call the digital turn, and more specifically at the global epicenter of much of these events, which was Columbia University during the 1990s. And for some years, Jesse Reiser and Nanako Umemoto were in close relationship with young and promising figures like Stan Allen, Greg Lynn, Sanford Quinter, among many others, that interestingly departed to very different approaches to the problem of the digital in architecture for their practices. Jesse and Nanako were, from my point of view, one of the most interesting and consistent practices emergent from that place and moment in time, always in the search for alternatives to new ways of engaging with the new contemporary problems on technique and theory, both in the terrain of the architectural competition and in academia. Their practice is still being written testament for new generations to keep digging into ways to interrogate the discipline of architecture through the project. Taking in consideration genealogy, lineage, and history of the discipline, their practice allows for a deep understanding and complexification of reality in many ways. Without giving up on elegance, their designs combine continuous forms, disruptions, exaggerations, disproportions, and monumentality, always transforming the context where they are implemented. The office projects result in milestones that instantly become architectural references for all times. So this 2023 Winter Festival in the Institute, we're trying to rethink the problem of monstrosity in architecture. Monstrosity thought as a combination of both classical precepts and sublime effects on design. I cannot think of a better practice than Jesse's and Nanako's to help us understand the riches for an architecture that exceeds the local and circumstantial towards transcendence in this sense. So, thank you again, Jesse and Nanako, for doing this. You're very welcome to this space of the Institute. And I wanted to let our audience in YouTube that can, of course, post comments in the chat, and I will try to read them if you like. If you have any questions for Jesse and Nanako after our conversations, I will gladly read them to them. So, without further ado, I'm going to start with the first question. This is like a general question in order to start talking. I would like to ask you what is that you're working on at the moment? Is there a competition you're working on, a new project? You're working on a new book after projects under consequences?
All three, actually. First, I just wanted to thank you for inviting us and including us in the Institute's discussion. It's really, a pleasure. We've had long, of course, history with you, and of course, and as well with friends in Argentina who have been, really in many ways formative for us. So, we're really glad, to be a part of this. But partial answer to your question, I think we're juggling a number of projects. There will be a house that we're going to be designing in Japan, in Hokkaido, for a client. So that's sort of just about to start. As well, an interesting collaboration on a competition for a entertainment and cultural center in China with Wolf Pricks. And yes, we're continuing to develop sort of past the book projects and their consequences. Actually, we're reformatting even projects and their consequences to be a small book, which will be a pocket book, because purely for marketing purposes, I think people enjoyed the Atlas. It was a portable thing, and it would get to a wider audience. So we're working, in the office and also with Philip Denny on a series of volumes. So the projects and their consequences became 3 volumes already, simply because we had to condense things. So yeah, we're juggling a number of things at once. Also, the opening of the Kahosiung Port Terminal, which they're doing the final work on. There was a pre-opening in March, but they're doing the final work on the interior of the tower. And so that should open, and we'll start to publish images and materials on that. So yeah, a lot of stuff going on at once.
I would like to ask you about these volumes that you are. Is it like it's kind of a reduction of the, or like a partition of the book, or you are developing something different?
Yeah, I mean, we're both reformatting it with the same material, but also gives us the opportunity to add and to update the material, because by reformatting the book to a smaller size, it made one volume ridiculously long, like 600 pages. It would be like a block, and so it for practical but also thematic reasons, we chopped it up into smaller volumes, and we're going to be adding more materials. In a way, it's also a revisiting of work, of speculative work that doesn't easily fit into the categories we kind of put in the Atlas or in projects. So there's a new little book called Chambers that would include the flux room. It would include stage set design, other speculative work that's more sort of the way outside of the strictly building projects.
That's fantastic. Okay, I can wait then. And you are still teaching, right?
Yeah, as far as I know.
Okay.
Still teaching at Princeton, and Nanako will be, she.
I have been teaching at WashU in St. Louis, and then several other schools. But since last summer, I took off the teaching because I had a surgery. But I will start teaching again from the January.
Okay, that's a lot of things. I don't know how you managed to do all that. So, happy to know you are very, very active. Okay, then I would like then to start with a question regarding your work that has to do with your first collaboration together. This is the Villa Farceri that you have published in your web. This is a project from 1984, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And I find that there is some sort of a narrative technique that you briefly talked about in other presentations that you did. Can you elaborate on this idea of the narrative project, and is this technique present today in the work that you are doing?
Well, yes, this technique has re-entered our work, I would say, in an interesting way. Currently, I'll get into that in a moment. But as a kind of background, this was a contribution to the Venice Biennale that Aldo Rossi directed, and so the way he did it, it was first of all an open Biennale. Anyone could contribute. He did ask us to submit work for it, but it was an open Biennale. It was explicitly related to projects that existed as texts. So there's an actual site, of course, for the Villa Farceri in the Veneto. But what really made it stand out for him was the written history of the garden of the Villa Farceri. So the villa, has been there, but the garden is completely erased. And so he, as a prompt, he asked everyone to address the textual side of the history. And in this case, it was a garden based on humanist principles. It was supposed to be an educational kind of garden, which kind of dealt with classical themes of Roman antiquity, miniaturized on the site. And so what we did was basically I was reading a book on the history of comedy, and it talked about comedic structure related to kind of traditional rites, Roman rites, having to do with a sequence of events that would happen that would go from, I think it was like a battle into a feast related to the carnival, to the Venetian carnival, of course, but earlier structure as well. So we took that as a structure that allowed us to kind of spatialize the sequence on the site all at once, and kind of following work that both Nanako and I had done in our thesis projects at Cranbrook and at Cooper Union, respectively. We began to kind of populate the site, along the structure of the narrative.
And that's something that you're still doing, like using, for example, texts in order to order the ideas?
Well, currently, this is a project I didn't talk about in our current work, but we're actually very much involved in. There was a project that was sparked by a 4th century Roman mosaic of a symposium. And I got really interested in the image of the symposium and what it could mean, especially given what current symposia are like at Princeton and other kind of schools. And so it got me really interested in kind of returning to a lot of the materials that we had more or less kind of put aside at the end of the 80s. So yeah, I mean, I've run a number of studios, and we have a planned symposium probably sometime next year involving Sanford Quinter and Beatrice Colomina in Tokyo, where we're going to return to some of the themes that are portrayed in the ancient mosaic. Of course, as you know, I mean, the symposium is actually, for the Greeks, it was a drinking party, quite literally, and it involved philosophical discussion. It involved, a lot of things having to do with the kind of embodied experience and the mind. So yeah, I mean, I think we've returned to some of those old interests, and so especially this past summer, we've gotten involved in the design of the actual space, and also even the objects, even the serving pieces that would be part of the meal and the discussion. The conceit here, kind of in a way in contrast to the Greeks and the Romans, is that instead of starting with a lofty subject, the design of the objects, and I guess your sort of thing on monsters is absolutely appropriate here, that the design objects themselves would be literally conversation pieces, and they would spark more interesting and maybe even elevated philosophical conversation. I don't know, but that's what we're thinking about, is approaching it as architects and designers and scenographers. We're going to the design elements of the visual and the tactile and the experiential, and how that would intersect thought and discussion.
Well, you used to say that you have these meta projects, like we talked in other conversations. When you are approaching a new design, a new competition, how much of the competition interests take part in the decision of the design? I mean, you're always thinking about something new, right? Even in some conversation, you say that you were waiting for the next competition in order to try some new ideas. So how much of the ideas, the agendas that you already have are involved in a project, and how much of the agenda of the competition or the client is part of this conversation?
I don't know. I don't think we purposely think about new ideas. It's more for the continuation of past work. But also we had to react to the new requirement of the competition. So we had to think about how we can deal with size or any other issues that they are giving us. So the previous, our work wasn't that much of the competition. So we had to come up with the whole side. With that side, we had to come up with a lot of ideas. But
that's the work in the 80s, basically.
Yeah, these are the work of 80s then.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, talking about the work in the 80s, there is a lot of projects or design that came from that time that work with the idea of collage. This one in particularly, the Venice Gateway, I believe that there is a lot of collage going on. but you can find this technique way later, also in projects like, I don't know, the Kansai National Library, or even the University of Applied Arts of Vienna, where you find like continuous organizations, but at some point some objects appear, like in order to disrupt this continuity or to generate, I don't know, this kind of breaks in the order. Is this technique still going on? Do you think that it has evolved? And what's the original idea behind it? I mean, why do you start using the collage, and how it has, in your opinion, evolved through your work?
Well, actually, this project didn't start with collage. This is the Piazza di Roma in Venice. It's entrance point of Venice.
Yeah.
And so it's mainly the project is this is a really interesting project we did, and we really love it. But also there are a lot of invention happens here, because before that we didn't think of this way, but this one is incorporating the circulation of buses, circulation of people, circulation of buses, and also each vehicle, bus and pedestrian cars, has a different maneuverability in the piazza. So we had to take that thing into the project. So these forms came out of how the buses can move here, or car can move here, and how pedestrian can move here. But also these offshoot of you see these tentacles had to go to the different islands.
Right.
Yeah, so this was a really fun project for us, but also we learned a lot. And then this idea continues to other projects.
Yeah, I mean, to back up a little bit, there's an interesting context for this. We had begun a research project with Stan Allen, and Stan was involved in this project, by the way, in the competition, to analyze the infrastructure of the water supply of New York State. It ended up being a massive mapping project, and we were all having difficulty moving from, I guess, kind of analysis and mapping to doing a design proposal. And then Stan found this competition for the Venice Gateway and said, hey, why don't we, kind of warm up by doing a competition? And it turned out that the competition was actually much more productive than the water project. We never really, moved that much forward in terms of the design, but the constraint, of time and the specificity of the project actually allowed us to pull together the interest in infrastructure, which came from, the water supply and the movement. Yes, collage, did come into it. But yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that it isn't just collage, that we were juggling a number of balls at once. So one of them was about infrastructure and movement. The other was, came from the legacy of working volumetrically and formally, even from projects like the German House. And then, yeah, the use of collage, which in a way, I mean, there's a volumetric set of operations, which one could argue are somewhat collaged. You look at this green model like you have on the screen. And then the other was quite literally about, putting collage, mapping material onto those volumes. More like rendering, frankly. It wasn't so much about, I don't know, the use value of collage as the kind of sole driver for the design, but it kind of fell into the project more as almost a rendering technique. But
Well,
yeah, I mean, there were a bunch of concerns at once. That's all. And Nanako described the systemic side of it, and movement, and all of the different groups that had to be addressed. You know.
well, here in Nanako and watching to these plans and models, there's a lot of Kahosiung going on, right? Like this idea of the infrastructure, the tentacles.
Right.
If you show me this project and Kahosiung, right one after the other, you won't be able to say what came first. You know,
Right.
that's
Right.
pretty nice.
Oh, you know, I mean, it's also as much about the love of machines or using the, you know, infrastructure or the architecture like a big, almost like the exhaust manifold on a 1960s Ferrari, something like that. You know, I mean, all of those interests come into play. But then, you know, in answer to your question, I think, you know, you go to the site. If you don't go to the site with nothing, you know, an architectural project is most, I don't know, valuable in a way in kind of bringing it to the constraints of the site and then having the site work on it. But it's not a matter of going to the site and getting everything from the site, because you won't get much. So our technique, in a way, is to bring a model or a way of working, you know, to the specifics of the site and the program, and then, you know, it works on that model, or we kind of think through the model in relationship to those you know, specific things.
But this one is really, we loved this project and we learned a lot but how we did this was that we articulate each different vehicles of movement, taxi movement, buses are different, tour buses are really different, but also we have to incorporate the movement of boat in the Venice. And then how we had to circulate the people within this the infrastructure system. So the one thing we had to separate these issues, but also we had to learn how to combine these movements. So that was really interesting. And also that applied to lots of different projects in the future, like build project Kahosiung or Taipei Music Center. There are a lot of issues from this project.
Well, to continue with the idea of the narrative, I wanted to ask you about your film references. I heard you a lot of times referring to Orson Welles movies, especially Citizen Kane, or even I remember you presenting some of the drastic shadows played in the Third Man, in that 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 moment where the guy is trying to escape, so he's in the how do you say it, like under the streets, and the shadows plays like some kind of rodnet shadows. I wanted to ask you how specifically these ideas influence the work, if they are through the images, if they are through the sequences, the narrative behind these films, and is there other references to pop culture that you may use in your work also?
Yeah, it's very hard to separate the strands out. But I mean, I guess one of the things about this project, which we found really kind of interesting, which is really the interesting thing about Vienna, which I think was something that was already very present in the 19th century, is that there would be a kind of public and kind of ceremonial, neoclassical side to the way in which people kind of use the city and the cultural institutions. So this is, you know, among the projects that's kind of arrayed on the Ringstrasse in Vienna. And there's even a triumphal arch for entering into the Angewandte or into the Mack Museum. So I don't know, there's one reality, in other words, for the kind of formal use of the city. And then there's this other side, which is what happens in the courtyards, which, you know, fortuitously, I don't know, relates almost to the unconscious. Like there's the kind of public Apollonian Venice, and then there's the kind of unconscious of Vienna, which happens, you know, in these tight spaces. And I think we were sort of, you know, it wasn't entirely intentional, but I think it's, you know, it's there in Freud, it's there in the people who existed in that city, where there would be this kind of dialogue between, you know, the kind of public presentation and public display and the, you know, walking in the city and attending cultural institutions. And this one, which is a very peculiar one, where, you know, you have the Academy of Fine Arts, which is a production place. And so I think we were really, it was also a kind of critique against making schools overly public, or making the processes in schools completely transparent to visitors. That there would be a kind of formal time and place to show work, and that would happen in a, you know, in this institution in a very specific way. But then there was also a kind of hidden production side where you wouldn't reveal the magic of production, of creation, yet it would, you know, that to maintain that kind of theatrical separation, even in the institution, you know, related to the city and how the public uses it. Very much different, say, than, you know, the way Liz Diller was arguing for Lincoln Center, where, you know, she wanted to put rehearsal on display or to publicize the institution. We argued almost for kind of a revival of a 19th century structure for the way in which institutions work in the city. And so the imagery, to get back to your question about the third man, I think plays with that. You know, that there's the Dutch angles and the subjectivity, the strange subjectivity happens in the courtyard, where nothing is, you know, the horizon line isn't a given and gravity is defied in some way and the space is warped. Yeah, that form of expression we thought was really interesting to play with here. And
but
yeah.
this project, there are lots of things are happening, even appear to be very simple, but each institution had to be separated and same time had to be connected. So there, it is like a maze, like a space we are creating. And if you take one path, you can only go to the school. And if you take another path, then you can go to library. Or you go to the main staircase, then you go to the public, the cafes and the study areas.
Right.
And also when you go to basement, and then you go to the theater. But also there's so many different connectivity is happening in these buildings.
Yeah, well, it's, yeah, sort of a balance between making things really separate and distinct, and then other things being very connected. So the view you're showing right now is from, like, what is it, the Oscar Kokoschka Platz. So you're, in a way, there's something very classical too. I mean, you're actually entering, this is the entrance for students and professors only. And they pass under that oval form, which is the library. And the general public would enter from the Ringstrasse through the Triumphal Arch, and then they would go to, they would have access to, you know, the lecture halls and final exhibition spaces, or to the Mack Museum, but they wouldn't be allowed into the place where the art is made or the thinking happens. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it was I think it was valuable for us in a way, not only to try to I don't know, advance arguments about publicity, but also in a way to acknowledge the value of keeping certain things distinct, and giving people time to work and not to be on public display.
Right. But also the same time, the facade treatment create moire patterns in the buildings, which give you some kind of illusion of the space.
Yeah, like this.
I mean, we knew
right?
we also knew who exactly which floor all of our colleagues were working on. This was an element, coming off of the architecture school. So we knew Hani Rashid was on this floor, and Wolf Prix was on that floor, and Zaha was on that floor. It was a very personal, kind of project for us. I mean, it wasn't an abstract, set of users, I might say.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you mentioned the atlas before, and I was wondering when. I don't know if you have a precise idea of when the Deleuzian epistemology start to affect your work or influence your work. I can intuitively say that it was like in the early 90s, the projects in the early 90s, but I don't know if you have an idea of when and why you started to get involved with those ideas. And the second question following that is, how do you think these ideas have affected not only your work today, but architecture expression in general? Is there some kind of legacy of all that effervescent ideas from the early 90s that you find today?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I think though the influence of Deleuze, came through our interaction with colleagues, at Columbia in the early period. So it would include, of course, Stan Allen and Greg Lynn, but also, figures like Jeffrey Kipnis and Sanford Quinter. And Sanford was probably, was actually in Deleuze's seminars, so he was more or less the direct sort of conduit to us regarding those ideas. And I, personally reading the material was really excited because, I think this is true for a lot of the theory that kind of influenced us. We sort of already had some experience designing and working. And so it wasn't a matter of harnessing, the ideas of French kind of post-structuralism as an abstract concept, but it seemed to connect very strongly, especially with material design and material practices. Like I was trained in metalsmithing, and so Deleuze's articles on nomadology and the logic of material transformation and social change was already in a way part of my equipment, although I wasn't able to articulate it that well, but it resonated with me. So I was super excited. It resonated in a much stronger way for me than, say, Derrida, which was perhaps too abstract and too kind of purely linguistically oriented.
More discursive, yeah.
And so, yeah, it was great. It was a lot of fun, and it was part of course, the scene at Columbia and the way we discussed work and projects and so forth.
And how do you think this is still affecting your work? I know you have that background, and you in a way grow as a practice intertwined with those ideas. But do you think that you're still going there in the search for I don't know, arguments, ideas, concepts, designs, in order to make like consistency with the work, or do you think that is something that you have already incorporated and I don't know, you don't have to?
I think in a way it's, yeah, I mean, I'm not constantly going back to Deleuze these days, but I think it's sort of, you know, probably could argue that it's, yeah, part of our equipment. It's part of the way our attitude and the way we think and work. And yeah, I mean, there always are surprises too. You know, I mean, you made a comment about, you know, this sort of strange relationship between continuity and the discrete in the work, and that was always there, I would say. I mean, but there were other influences too. I remember, you know, reading really interesting argument from Venturi about, you know, how does Mies, you know, would a Coke machine completely throw off or ruin a Mies building? It was almost a reality test, like that there would be the possibility of inclusions even in a continuous space that would be kind of have nothing to do with that reality and that logic, that would nevertheless have to be there. So,
right.
Yeah, it's
okay, and well, maybe talking a little bit about these meta projects that you presented in other conversations. You presented a series of these projects, but there were two that I believe they are still in the works. I think they are all still in the works, and they are all still influencing your work. But I think that they are moving in different directions. I am referring to, well, the RoadNet project and the Surface project. Is it some sort of synthesis within these two projects, especially since, I don't know, these two great projects of Kahosiung and Taipei, we can see like there's a sort of synthesis. But do you think that there is happening that maybe there is building another agenda, another project that is emerging from this one? I'm thinking, is there another project emerging from these two last big projects that you built?
Really hard to say. I mean, I guess the first thing, which might have been covered in some of the writing, but, you know, both, I guess, you know, of course, the Surface project pre-existed our engagement with it. It was already underway, you know, from REM to FOA and all of those other figures, MVRDV, before we got involved in it. Of course, like many architects, we got fascinated with it, but also saw shortcomings. But the RoadNet was actually something that came about as the result of our collaboration with an engineer, with Izzy Sinek. Because, yeah, I mean, I got into, yeah, I mean, it may be an overly long story, but it was first suggested as a logic for dealing with the sway in the continuous building, a purely pragmatic, you know, kind of solution for having, you know, these very complex slab surface project, and then
surface. We came up with this surface organization of the slab, which include all kinds of programs. That's mainly library, right? The Kansai library we started. Right. But we didn't know how, we thought that can be a structural system. And then we talked to an engineer, and he said, no, this doesn't support the building. So that he gave a suggestion that some grid system of hanging cable net from the roof to the slab.
Right. And then the perimeter rod net.
Right. And then so the structural system is only like a two touching the ground, and others are hung by the ceiling. Not the ceiling, the roof.
Yeah.
By structural roof.
Yeah, folded roof. Yeah.
But so a lot of those logics came out of suggestions by the structural engineer, and then we started to run with them, play with them.
We start using a lot of
as a logic, kind of tried to kind of do every possible variation of that logic.
right vibration, but also other one is also working with intention. So each project we utilize this idea in each project in different way.
Or yeah, I mean, like the image you're showing right now of the airport really was the next iteration from the kind of shell tube structure of the 014 tower, turning it horizontal and adding more sectional variation. But it came from what I guess you would call it a design model, that we kept exploring.
Yeah, this idea of the diagrid maybe is in a way like an integration of the surface and the roadmap, you may say.
Yes.
And it's something that you use different ways, even in this project that I really love, that you don't show enough.
This is a great project.
Sorry.
I said this is a great project. We enjoy doing this project.
Yeah, I love this one. I was wondering how this, because something that happens in your designs that is very beautiful is you can see them like completely different designs. You may present them as each one of them like made by another studio, but if you go deeper, you will find these like hints where you can correlate them, So this idea of the meta projects that you present, I found that it's like it's kind of hanging over the projects, but it doesn't define them. You can use them like in a very various ways. So I was wondering this one if there is a project that you can like relate to, like a meta project that you can relate to this one, because I can see Kahosiung here, I can see the water gardens, there are a lot of projects going on, but not explicitly, like they are like implicitly behind them, right?
Right. This one is how do I say it? This one is essentially the surface project, or also other structural system. We had to utilize the idea three-dimensionally, so it became like overlapping the vertically. It's not a horizontal.
Right. I mean, it was also we did take the program at face value. That the Adidas company wanted a certain number of kind of sub offices to be connected, and so there was a kind of a structure to their programming that allowed us, or kind of pushed us in the direction of working with these multiple kind of overlapping surfaces with galleries, overhanging galleries.
But also public. This is also the gate of Adidas compound. So the public goes through this the building, but we had to separate the
to distribute them, to the campus.
So they can go into the building, but they can go through the landscape on the ground level.
And then, yeah, there would also, there's that landscape on ground, and then there's a kind of underbelly scape of the building, of the that you walk under.
Yeah, it's very beautiful. Well,
but I mean, there's also, there were elements also in the culture, in the wider architectural culture, like Agadir, for example. I mean, there are influences on the project, which I would want to kind of point out too. I think this is the exciting thing about architecture, because most of our contemporaries don't want to say it, but I think the exciting thing is that there are vital projects that aren't simply connected to one studio or one author, that cross authors. So certain elements of this project would have been unthinkable without that precedent.
Right. Well, moving on to the last comments in this conversation, I would like to ask you about well, these two magnificent recent projects. I was wondering, because they were so close in date. I know they have been some years in the working. I know that this project in particular, the Taipei, has suffered a lot of changes, but I believe that they relate not only in a formal way, but also in an organizational way. We talked about how Kahosiung relates to some of your early ideas about infrastructure and about geometry. I don't know. Can you elaborate in the way that they relate with each other? I mean, they were developed in similar moments, right? So they must share some ideas regarding your agendas.
Well, I would say that the competition stage version of the music center, is much more closely tied to what finally was built in Kaohsiung.
Yeah.
But because of the programmatic changes, the increase in the size of the main hall, and all kinds of other, forces at work on the project, most of that is gone, I would say, from the as-built version of it. But I think we were also drawing from earlier, interests as well. Not so much, of course. Yeah, the competition version of this dealt with a trilobe theater, which in its beginnings goes all the way back to the Cardiff Day Opera House competition.
Zaha won that one. But since then, we really wanted to do trilobe building. So that when we were invited to do this competition, we really brought that thing to the Taipei Music Center. But so that we tried to work out really hard, but it didn't work out well.
Well, yeah, I mean, the pop music people, who were then kind of running it didn't, I mean, probably quite rightly, didn't like the idea of three distinct halls being fused together. They wanted to have everyone in one big space.
Yeah, they changed the program.
And yeah, as I mentioned, they made it much larger. But yeah.
Yeah, in a sense, it was the early design. It was much more infrastructural and has this idea of this tentacle monster, right? That you develop in Kaohsiung. But this way, it is kind of. I like it because it's kind of a collection of objects that are very intertwined. Nevertheless, they're intertwined by the circus typology, and in a way, geometrically, they share a lot. So I think in a way it's maybe like and not an explicit way to connect a collection of objects that relate in the end, right?
Yeah, I mean, this was, I mean, I guess the only kind of general, one general kind of thing that would cross the two projects was an interest in kind of creating artificial grounds. So, you know, these object buildings, like the main hall sits on a built ground, which is more of the back of house functions of that theater, and, you know, all of, kind of internal stuff, mechanics of the theater happen in the groundwork. And on the other side of the road, you know, a similar idea about a fabric being a kind of ground for the objects that sit on them. And in Kahosiung, yeah, I mean, it's an edge project, but, you know, it goes back to even earlier work that we did for the Hudson River, making proposals for the East River, which is an edge project, an elevated esplanade, which was infrastructural and in scale and efficient.
I think I have it. Let me see. I think you're referring to this one, the West Side conversions, right?
To a certain extent, and even prior. I mean, this is an elaboration, but even prior to that, there was a
development of edge,
a 12-mile development of the East River edge that the Van Allen Institute funded. But yeah, I mean, that's where, and this is a kind of a more detailed elaboration of that model on the West Side competition. But yeah, we kind of finally got to realize some of that in Kahosiung as a built reality.
Yeah, that's incredible that you were able to produce these great ideas, or at least a version of these ideas, and build them. I have one last question, and then we can have some questions of the audience, if you like. I was wondering if you may have an opinion, a broad opinion about these projects that are being made of in China and Middle East, where international firms from all over the world take part into what seems to be some of the more weirdest dreams of architecture from the 1960s and 70s. I'm referring to these great works that are making in some of Middle East countries. How do you see these works? Because I don't know, when I see the Line, for example, or these big projects in China that are being developed, I feel like some kind of encounter sensations, you may say, because it's great that these projects are being developed, but I don't know how deep the discipline reaches are going, you know. But it's fascinating because some of the most relevant, you may say, firms in the world are taking part in this. So I just wanted to know how do you see this this like explosion from the last 10-20 years?
Well, it's complicated, you know, politically as well as you know, related to the disciplinary issues. I mean, on the one hand, you know, it's very exciting, and you know, for an architect or architects, that there are countries willing to kind of do big projects like that. It's almost, you know, an impossibility in the United States at this point. So on the one hand, the ambition and the excitement of you know, having an opportunity to do it is tempting, and you know, may lead to, positive results. But on the other hand, I think you're right, some of these projects can also be compromised because they're not, fully worked through. They're done, in a very kind of detached and extended manner, so yeah, I mean, speaking from our own experiences, both in Kahosiung and Taipei, we were very much hands-on. I think we probably burned up our design fee, but it was not something that you could sort of set and forget. But I think a lot of these other larger projects kind of also fall into a category of indifference. The foreign architect will kind of come up with a huge utopian plan, but they're either unwilling or unable, to kind of work in a very kind of careful and sustained and detailed way on those projects. So, yeah, it's complicated. I remember, Stephen Hall saying to me that, he can only expect about, at best 70% when he's doing a project in China. He's happy if he gets about 70% of what he wants.
Right.
Simply because of the, that's enough, that's all you can do. It's pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we're touching the 90% projects.
Well,
but we also had very, helpful and, I would want to kind of put in, support for our executive architects were amazing, Fei and Cheng, and we knew them well. Actually we taught the second in command there at Columbia in the mid-90s. So there was a very close relationship, and they really fought these projects and did a lot of the political things that had to be done.
Yeah, I believe that in these big projects, that's a very important thing to do, to have the control in those stages.
Yeah, it was very personal. All the ones we've been involved in, for better or worse, have been very personal projects in terms of working with the people.
Yeah.
And
Dubai,
not detached.
Dubai project.
Dubai too, yeah.
Yeah.
Not subjective personal, but more that there were very close personal relationships among the people, to get a good project.
That's great. That's great. Well, I believe that I am out of questions. We have a couple of questions from Eddie Goldenberg in the YouTube chat. Yeah, he's asking, all through the 90s and the early 2000s, there was a pervasive discourse of emergence and bottom-up design strategies at Columbia too. How do you make design determinations in your own process? He asks.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the last bit.
How do you make design determinations in your own process, taking into consideration these bottom-up design strategies at Columbia?
Well, I mean, I think, in the reality of projects, it's more a question of bridging, bottom up and top down decision making, some of which is not even your decision to make.
Right.
So it's never going to be as, closed or hermetic as self-generated, purely bottom up work. Yeah, I mean, there's also a kind of workflow which involves a kind of dialogue with the people who are, represent the project. It's not, it's not a linear process at all, but there's a real, an important back and forth,
right.
Which, I would say, helps the project. So it isn't a case of pure authorship ever.
Well, in a way, I believe that it could also function as a restriction to some of the authorial agendas that you may have. I mean, it forces you to confront to something that is external. So
Right.
there are some hierarchical decisions that you have to, I believe, manage and contrast.
Sure. And also, yeah, I mean, I think we come to it also not with the idea that there's one right solution.
Yeah.
But that, kind of draw on our resources from past work and from other people's work. And it becomes a kind of dialogue and a synthesis of those things. So it's as much about being receptive,
right,
in the way you work, as it is about, more so than, I don't know, kind of a one-way process of authorship. That you have to be even receptive to the design itself.
Right.
It's not actually about materializing an already formed concept.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, I think there are all the questions. I only have to thank you again. You know how much I admire your work. I believe that you are, if not the most, one of the most interesting offices of today. I like the way that you integrate academia with design, and your faith in competition, in architectural competitions, is something that amazes me, and I encourage anyone watching this video to look forward for your work and to research about you. Thank you very much for doing this, and I hope we can talk again soon.
Absolutely, Santiago. Thank you.
Thank
for
you.
the opportunity, and love your institution. We need more of this kind of discussion, and more connections between our spaces, as they say. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.